reason Mark is so important is because Mark is the first gospel. And because he is the first gospel, his outline of the gospel, his structure of the gospel, is considered to be rather sacred by the rest of the gospel writers. They all adhere to his outline. Whether they had to or not, we could argue, but they did. Because gospel is a unique kind of literary form when it's put in this kind of writing. No other religion uses that term for its writing. There are no Hindu gospels, Buddhist gospels, really. Christianity is the only religion that has this unique kind of literary form. And it has a basic similarity that all four Gospels use. You start out with a little introduction, whether it's one sentence like Mark, a big prologue like John, or the infancy narratives like Matthew and Luke. Then you move into the Galilean ministry. And in the Galilean ministry, Jesus initially has success, and then they start to fall apart. Then you move from the Galilean ministry down to a journey to Jerusalem. The journey to Jerusalem in Mark is 1 chapter. In Luke, it is 10. So you can see you can do all kinds of things with that. Once you get Jesus down to Jerusalem, and you have him enter into Jerusalem, our Palm Sunday experience, then you enter into the final form, which is the Passion narrative, suffering, death, and resurrection. All four Gospels have the very same structure. They did not feel that they could deviate. And Mark is considered to be the one who created that structure. Mark was written, most people think anyway, in Rome. And so those little house churches that he was dealing with were in Rome. You could not take the Gospel of Mark, which was aimed at the issues that the Roman church was having in those days. You couldn't just take that Gospel and go over to Syria, where you have another group of Christians who are far more Jewish than the ones that Mark was dealing with. Most of Mark's congregation would have been Gentile. You go over to Syria, and Antioch there in Syria, and you have more Jewish Christians. And the gospel that seems to have been composed in that area is what we call the Gospel of Matthew. But you couldn't say to Matthew, well, we already got a gospel here, just use ours. Just take ours and read it to your people. And well, you can't do that. Because they have different issues, and they're different people. So what Mark did was, he already knew about Matthew already knew about Mark's gospel. So he took that, and he decided, that's going to be the center point of my gospel too. I'm going to follow the basic outline of Mark. So he inserts that. That's where he begins to start. But then he also had some other material that Mark never had. Over the years, some bodies had started to collect a lot of the sayings of Jesus. It wasn't a narrative, it wasn't a story, it was just a whole bunch of sayings. Now, we can figure out how that works because if you work backwards, if you took Matthew, Mark, and Luke and lined them all up, and then you went to Matthew and Luke and you cut out every reference that you knew came from Mark, you'd still have a lot of material left. And oddly enough, some of that material would match up word for word. Not necessarily in the same place, but the stories would be word for word. And you have to ask, where did that come from? Well, you could say, well, with just mental telepathy, they just figured that out, but that won't get you far. The best explanation is they had a document. And you find Luke had the same document. Ultimately, in biblical studies, this is called the Q source. It looks similar to what you would find if you would get on Google and type in the Gospel of Thomas. If you'd see that, the Gospel of Thomas, which was written much later, but it's a similar kind of document. Nobody has ever found Q. Some people dispute the fact that there was such a document, but you have to account for this material somehow. So most scholars will make a reference to this sayings source, Q. So Matthew has at hand the Gospel of Mark, and he has a whole bunch of these sayings from the Q material, and he has some material that nobody knows where he got it from. It's unique to him. So he's going to use all this material. The basic outline is going to be from Mark, and then Matthew is going to reshape it to fit his community. And his community is a Jewish Christian community. And he has at least two big factions in this community. He has the old guard Jewish Christian, who thinks that we never, ever should have left the Jewish Christian mission. We never should have let in the Gentiles. We never should have had that council in Jerusalem and let Barnabas and Paul get away with it. We should have never done that. We need to go back. Well, Matthew is sympathetic to a bunch of that. Matthew is sympathetic that we don't want to lose our tradition here. That is important. If we're going to move forward, we can't just go out of nowhere. We have a good, long tradition that we want to hold sacred. Well, then you've got these others, Jewish Christians, who are saying, look, I thought we claimed that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Torah and the works of law. Is that not what we believe? Yes, we do believe that. Well, then, if he's the fulfillment and we have him, why do you need the Torah anymore? It's over. It worked while it needed to work, but we don't need it anymore. Let's not get held back by that old teaching. Let's get rid of it. Well, Matthew's a little sympathetic to some of that too, namely the moving on. Matthew knows you can't go back. You just simply say what you want. Whether it's today or at the time of now, you cannot move back. There's just no back to move to. But on the other hand, Matthew's problem and his challenge, how do you keep these in tension? How do you keep them in some kind of balance? And so, for those people who think we're going to throw everything out, he has a Jesus that is not in that camp at all. I have come to not do away with the law and the prophets, but to fulfill every last aspect. That's pretty strong. Can't get any idea that he's going to be a rebellious antinomian, throw it all out person. But on the other hand, he knows the church has moved on, and he's even got Gentiles in his church now. So he's got to kind of meet those needs. And so he's got that interesting, some think he's talking to himself or about himself, in chapter 13. At the end of a whole bunch, chapter 13 has a whole bunch of parables, and then Jesus at the end in verse 51 says, have you understood all this? They answered, yes. Well, don't believe them because they haven't. But here's the important part. And he said to them, now here's Matthew's principle. Therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven, many people think Matthew's talking about himself here, is like the master of a household who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. And that pretty much sets the stage for what Matthew is trying to do. He's got big problems with the Jewish synagogue. Unlike at the time of Mark, where the thought of being thrown out was being circulated around, but they had not been thrown out. By Matthew's time, Matthew was probably written 10 years after Mark, say 75 or 80. By that time, the synagogue had acted, and they had chosen to expel the Jewish Christians from the synagogue. Matthew is outraged by that. You want to hear somebody who's outraged and what it sounds like? Read chapter 23 of Matthew. That's a real vitriolic approach to the Pharisees. Keep in mind, you're talking about the Pharisees who were alive at the time of Matthew, not the ones who were alive at the time of Jesus. Jesus and the Pharisees probably never argued anyway as fiercely as does Matthew and the Pharisees. But Matthew's outraged about all of this. So he's got to work that into his program. He structures his gospel after he does the basic structure of Mark. He decides he's going to have 5 major discourses. So that's what you have in Matthew's gospel, 5 major discourses. The first one starts in chapter 5, goes from chapter 5 to 7. And it's the most important of all the 5 discourses. 5 to 7 is the great Sermon on the Mount. Another way of looking at the Sermon on the Mount, it's Matthew's handbook for how to live in the kingdom of God. And of course, it's probably one of the most popular segments in any of the Gospels in Christianity. Everybody knows about the Sermon on the Mount. His second discourse is called a missionary discourse. It's all about discipleship, what it means to be a disciple and how that works. And that's in chapter 10, starting in verse 5 and going through verse 42. The third discourse is all about parables, chapter 13. He just dumps a whole bunch of parables into one chapter. They're pretty interesting. Some of those parables you'll find also in Mark, and Luke will have some advantage to them. The fourth discourse is on the church. Matthew's gospel is the only gospel that uses the word church. He does it 2 times in 2 places, anyway. Chapter 16, Peter, the keys to the kingdom, the church. And chapter 18 are the 2 places where you find the word church used. So chapter 18 is a whole discourse on the meaning of the church. And then the final one is what's called the final judgment discourse, chapter 23 through chapter 25. So Matthew does not do the same things that Mark does, although he has some of the same material, because he's got different issues that he's trying to deal with. His issues are going to be, what does it mean to be a Jewish Christian in the church today? His issue is going to be, how do we relate to the synagogue? How is that going to happen? He also is very concerned with, how are we going to make the transition to the Gentiles? And most important, how am I going to keep all this together? How do I preserve the best of our tradition and keep us moving ahead and keep us all together? Very similar issues to what we're dealing with today in the church in many cases. That's why some of these Gospels are so important, because while they're not solving our problems, they've got similar ones, and it's good to see how they deal with theirs. So that's basically what you will get in Matthew. And Matthew has some really popular material. Most of it comes out of that Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, the Beatitudes, things like that. When it gets to the Passion narrative, Matthew borrows the Passion narrative of Mark and pretty much follows it down the line until the very ending. And Matthew has a more suitable ending for people. He doesn't lead you up with it. They said nothing to nobody, for they were afraid the end. No, he has Jesus being raised up. Lots of cosmic things happening at the resurrection. The earth shakes and so on and so forth, because this is a cosmic event for Matthew. And then you have some appearance stories. And then in the final chapter of Matthew, he has Jesus come with his disciples to the mountain, a mountain that he's designated. And there he gives them their final mission, whereas they are to go out to all the nations, preaching the gospel in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. There's a little interesting phrase before he says all that. Once he gathers his disciples around him, Matthew makes the comment, and there were still some who did not believe. This is after it's all happened. He says, there were still some who did not believe. Now, all the Gospels will give us these kinds of hints that everybody wasn't convinced. Which means, if we find it difficult to be fully convinced at times, if we find it difficult to believe in all of this material, well, don't think you're alone, and don't think that it would have been any easier if you could have been alive at the time of Mark or Matthew or before that and watched all this happen, because they were there, they saw it, and they still had a difficult time in grasping it and believing it. Matthew, for years, was considered the church's favorite gospel. It was used very, very strongly in its liturgy and prayer, and so it still does have a prominent place to play. The Lord's Prayer that we recite can be found in 3 places: Matthew, Luke, and the Didache, which is not in the Bible, but the one that we've chosen to use always is out of Matthew's Gospel. So Matthew, very, very important gospel, but mostly aimed at that Jewish Christian. Well, still in Antioch, there was other groups that were not Jewish Christian, were Gentile. And one of them, of course, is by this fellow named Luke. Now, Luke's gospel, as I mentioned before, is part of a 2-part series. Luke had this understanding about history, about salvation history, being divided into 3 parts. The first part was the time of Israel, and for Luke that would include the Old Testament. Then the second period was the period of Jesus, the middle of time for Luke, and that gets portrayed by him in the Gospel. The third period is the period of the church, and that gets portrayed in the Acts of the Apostles. And you'll notice that the Acts of the Apostles does not have an ending. It just stops. But it doesn't solve any of the issues that are left unwound by the time you get there. That's on purpose, because we're still moving. We belong to that third period, which is still up and running. So Luke had that threefold understanding of salvation history. His gospel, therefore, is the high point for him, the middle of history. This is all about Jesus. He also had a copy of Mark, and he uses that same outline just like Matthew did. He also had a copy of that same source, so he used it. Now sometimes when Matthew and Luke will use the same source, they'll use it differently. They take it and they're not afraid to shape it to meet their own needs. And so you'll notice that rather than have a Sermon on the Mount, Luke has a Sermon on the Plain. Part of the reason for that is Matthew, being a Jew, likes the idea of Jesus and his divine nature being manifested in a grandiose theophany where he's on the mountain giving out the new teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. And lots of that kind of folderol that goes on in Matthew. Luke doesn't like that. Luke wants Jesus to be down with the people, rubbing elbows. He's always one with the people. So Luke takes the Sermon on the Mount and he makes it into a Sermon on the Plain. And it's not as long as Matthew. It's kind of split up a little bit. He has the Lord's Prayer, but it's not as long as is Matthew. Many scholars would say Luke's version is probably closer to the original than Matthew's. Matthew has been added to. So, Luke has some special interests himself. He portrays Jesus as an innocent prophet. An innocent prophet who's come to proclaim the good news to his people, only to find himself rejected by those very people. In the course of this, using Mark's outline, using some of the stuff from the Q source and all of that, there are some interests that are unique to Luke. Luke has a special interest in the outcast. He has special interest in sinners. Luke spends more time talking to and about and showing you women in the community than any of the other Gospels. There's more women who actually have names in Luke's Gospel than there are in any of the others. Luke also has a special theme of table fellowship. Luke likes to show you and how Jesus spends so much of his time either going to a meal, at a meal, coming home from a meal, and how much of his teaching is focused around eating, around meals. Robert Parris, who is a Franciscan scholar, done a lot of study on Luke and table fellowship, is fond of saying that Luke is the only gospel where Jesus literally eats himself to death. If you like food, you'd like Luke. So, but he follows Matthew pretty carefully, but see, Matthew can presuppose so many things because he's preaching to Jewish Christians. They've got a rich history with the Torah, with Jewish prayer, with Jewish liturgy. Matthew doesn't have to worry about that. They already know how that stuff works. Luke is up against it because his people don't come from that background. So he has to start everything from scratch. He has to give them a little catechism on how to pray. So at the Lord's Prayer, it's Luke's version where the disciples come to Jesus and say, give us a form of prayer. These other groups can be identified by their prayer form. We don't have a prayer form. So he taught them this prayer. Then you get the Lord's Prayer as their prayer form. And then you have these interesting stories that follow that don't seem to match because they're stories about perseverance. A story, an oddball story, about a guy who has a friend who comes at midnight and he didn't have any hospitality, any bread or anything, so he gives to his neighbor, trying to get his neighbor up. His neighbor won't get up. And the purpose of the story is his neighbor just bangs on the door until the guy gets so irritated he gets up. And the guy gets what he wants. And then he's got another story about a woman and an unjust judge, supposedly, who won't give this woman justice, and she won't quit nagging him, and she goes back and over and over and over until eventually he says, okay, yeah, whatever you want, I'm done. And what are those stories about? They're about perseverance. These are funny little stories in a way, but they're also stories that say, keep at it, prayer is not a once and for all thing. You've got to keep at it and keep at it. We're not quite sure how it gets answered, so don't get discouraged if you pray and nothing seems to happen. The most important thing is stay with it. And so Matthew doesn't have to teach his people that, but Luke has to do that. You'll notice also, Raymond Brown says anyway, that Luke gives us a Jesus that everybody can love. And when you read Luke, you can see that. Luke, the portrait of Jesus that Luke has emphasizes such things as kindness, gentleness, understanding, always reaching out to the outcasts, always having table fellowship with the lepers, the people that, society has sort of scratched off, all of those kinds of things. So Luke is a very popular gospel for lots of people based on the portrait of Jesus. And of course, Luke is dealing with his own community issues. Luke has a problem with who's my neighbor? Who am I responsible for? Who's considered part of the group and who's not? Because in some aspects, the idea of a traditional idea of a neighbor was a person who was my family member or my extended family. Beyond that, I have no responsibility for you. Luke wants the people to understand we are all neighbors. We don't build walls or keep out people because we are all one in Christ Jesus. And he's got this interesting story about who is my neighbor, the parable of the Good Samaritan. The way Luke tells it is all about neighborliness. And what Luke wants to say is everybody, all believers are neighbors. So he has a lot of those kinds of things. People who work a lot with the poor and the outcast and the prisoners and all of that find Luke's gospel very attractive because Jesus does that same sort of thing. He always has that sensitivity. Similar, somewhat, to Matthew, but then again very different. All these gospels have a great similarity. They're talking about the same Jesus. But they have lots of differences based on the issues in the community that they're facing. Every gospel is facing community issues. These gospels are not the result of somebody who went to the Iowa's Writers Workshop and came back and said, I think I'll write a story about Jesus. No way. That was not at all in their mind. They wrote about Jesus to meet needs that the community had that had to be in some way addressed. So, and Luke presupposes, because it's the way he composed it, he presupposes, of course, that you're going to read the second volume. So what he does is he sets up the first volume whereby Jesus does some interesting things. The second volume is the early Christian community continues doing those same interesting things. So the themes that you see already unfolded in Luke, if you just kept reading and read into the Acts of the Apostles, you'd notice those very same themes are now being retaught to us from the perspective of the church. Most people don't read them together because in the Bible now they're cut apart. But if you want to have an interesting adventure sometime, read together as one story the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, and you'll be surprised how much you can notice these same themes that will continue on. And then you have this interesting thing called the Gospel of John, which some people really dislike, some people really like, some people are not quite sure what to do with it. It doesn't seem to fit Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John does not seem to have known Mark's gospel, although some scholars argue that because there's similar material, it sounds like John must have known Matthew or Luke or one of those other Gospels, but there's no way of showing or proving that they do. He certainly had access to the common tradition. Now, the portrait that you have in the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John is written about the year 100. Lots has happened. Jesus died in the 30s. Mark's Gospel was around 70. Matthew, Luke, 80, 85. Now comes this Gospel, the Gospel of John, about 100. By this time, the Christians have long since been booted out of the synagogue. And so there's a big, strong polemic in the Gospel of John that basically says, we don't need it. We don't need your temple. We don't need your synagogue. We have Jesus. Jesus is for us what the temple was for you, what the synagogue was for you. We don't need that. That's why John has Jesus cleansing the temple way up in chapter 2. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that happens way down at the end of the ministry of Jesus. But up here in Mark, or in John, it happens real early. The Gospel of John is divided into 2 parts, 2 books. The first 12 chapters are called the Book of Signs. And what John does is he unfolds the first 12 chapters, the teaching of Jesus, around 7 major signs. A sign in any other gospel would be called a miracle and would be described as power, dunamis. In John, he uses never the word miracle. It's always a sign, a semeo. And that's because it always has a deeper meaning. Every sign, on all 7 of these signs, are John's attempt to unfold for us the true identity of Jesus. The sign is an action that Jesus does that in some way is supposed to manifest the reality of God's presence in and through Jesus. At the end of a sign, you'll generally get a designation. Did anybody believe this? Sometimes it'll say, and they believed him. Other times it'll say, they didn't believe a word of it. So everybody doesn't believe that. But the first part is unfolding the signs. And here they are. The first sign is the wedding feast of Cana, chapter 2, 1 to 12. The sign value, Jesus is the abundance of salvation. Wine symbolized often salvation. He has 7 stone water jars that replaces the purification rites of Judaism. And there's enough wine here for about 500 wedding parties. So it's wine in abundance. Second sign, the healing of an official son, chapter 4, verse 43 to 54. Jesus is the giver of life. Many of these signs say that. Third sign, chapter 5, 1 to 5, the healing of a paralyzed man. It's kind of an interesting little story. I don't like this guy. It's kind of an interesting story. He's kind of crotchety, and Jesus bends over but goes out of his way to heal the guy. And he only asks him one thing, now shut up, don't tell everybody I did this. And he goes and blabs it to every single person he can find. Fourth sign, chapter 6, 1 to 15, the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus is the bread of life. And notice always its abundance. This is the chapter that also deals with the Eucharist in John's Gospel. It's the only place where John deals with the Eucharist, unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Then you have another sign, the 5th one, walking on water. Chapter 6, 16 to 24. The purpose of walking on water is not to prove Jesus is God, because only Jesus could walk on water, and you and I can't. But that's not really the point. The point is, in the midst of all this, Jesus tells them who I am. It is I. Do not be afraid. It is I, ego eimi. the same identification that God gave to Moses when Moses kept asking him, "Who are you? I need to tell my people who I'm working for. Give me your name." And he won't do it except, "I am who I am." It's the same thing Jesus does here. Chapter 6 sign, very interesting thing. Chapter 9, 1 to 12. Healing of the man born blind. It's an amazing, interesting story. Jesus is the giver of sight. Seventh sign, chapter 11, 1 to 44, the raising of Lazarus. All of those signs point to some aspect of the divine nature of Jesus, who he is as God. This is called his work. You'll read a lot in the Gospel of John about doing my work. The work is revealing God in and through the life and ministry of Jesus. And then when Jesus is going to leave, he tells his disciples, "I'm going back to the Father, and I need to do that because you're going to need some help, and I'll prepare some help for you. But you are therefore going to have to continue my work when I am gone." And it's this very same word, pointing out the presence of God in and through the life and ministry and teaching of Jesus. Second book starts in chapter 13 and goes to the end. And that is called the Book of Glory. Now, the first half of the book of John, Gospel of John, covers 3 years. The second half covers a handful of days. Chapter 13 through 17 is a long discourse called the Farewell Discourse. It's portrayed as one long meal. It's not a Passover meal, but it's the final meal Jesus celebrates with his disciples. In those chapters, Jesus is going to explain to the disciples, he's leaving them, they're going to stay, they're going to be empowered with the Spirit, and they are going to carry on the work of Jesus, and they will be able to do so because he's sending them help in the form of the Paraclete, or the Advocate, or the Spirit. They will have help, and so they don't have to worry. But that's how it's going to go. Interesting little scenario, the way that second half opens with a scene you find nowhere else, foot washing. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Last Supper opens with the institution of the Eucharist there with the Passover meal. In John, it opens up with the washing of the feet. The farewell discourse ends in chapter 17, which is that famous long prayer of Jesus, where Jesus prays for the success of the disciples. And then with chapter 18, you're into the Passion narrative. Now, one thing to keep in mind, the Passion narrative in John is very different than it is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is a victim. He suffers and he dies and it all hurts. And he's really a terrified victim in all of that. In the Gospel of John, it's not like that at all. As soon as he walks in, he takes over. Before you know it, Pilate is on trial. Judaism is on trial. Jesus is totally in charge. And he knows what's going on from the beginning to the end. The high point in the Gospel of John is the crucifixion. That's the exaltation and the glorification of Jesus. That's everything in the Gospel leads up to that. In every other Gospel, it's the resurrection. Not in John. It is the exaltation. When Jesus is on the cross, in John's Gospel, he's still in charge. He's not hanging there crying out, my God, why am I forsaken? He's looking around, make sure everything's in place, gets his mother a place to stay, talks to John over here and whatnot, and then he surveys it and sees everything's in place, and he basically says, okay, I think this is done. Pulls down the curtain and says, it is finished. And this, of course, is what you need. You want to stand up and clap and applaud because this is total victory. He's pulled this off. He has won this battle. Now, you do have resurrection stories, and they're interesting ones. Mary Magdalene, especially. And then you have this other character that pops up toward the end of the gospel called the beloved disciple. He's the favorite in the Gospel of John. He's not given any name at all. He takes claim for being the person behind most of the material in this gospel. And then John's gospel ends in chapter 20 with a very suitable ending, but then you notice there's also chapter 21. Where did it come from? Well, nobody knows except it's in the oldest manuscripts, so it's been around forever. But there's a couple more appearances, and then in chapter 21, that's where Peter gets rehabilitated. Many think Peter was still so important at that time that John could not leave the church in the hands of the beloved disciple. That wouldn't fly. He has to get Peter back in place, in line. So that rehabilitation of Peter is a chance for Peter to start over again. Feed my lambs, feed my sheep, feed my lambs, follow me. And then the Gospel of John ends. John is a very rich gospel. There are many, many aspects to this gospel that people have liked. It begins very interestingly with an understanding of Jesus that is far different than anything else. It's called exaltation Christology, because it says that in the beginning, before anything else was created in the whole world, Jesus and God had a relationship. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then this magnificent hymn starts to unfold what this divine aspect is. And then in verse 14, and the Word became flesh. And that's when all this magnificent divinity and presence of God gets immersed into our world, and then the rest of it unfolds. So that's kind of how these Gospels took shape. Now, I was only asked to talk about how they took shape. I wasn't assigned to tell you what they mean. So you can have somebody else do that. You can say a whole lot more even about how they take shape. But the things to always remember, they're all four complete and separate on their own. They are not lacking anything. The church has insisted from the very beginning that we never try to scrunch them together and make them all one big happy story. That's why the church has insisted we have four of them. Because it takes this to try to even get some grasp of who this Jesus really is. We feel, the church feels anyway, that with these four Gospels, we have basically what we need. Our plate is full. We don't need any more. And we don't need to tamper with them by scrunching them up. Appreciate each one for what it is. And we're fortunate enough in our church, now we have cycles. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a cycle that switches every year. And we're about to do that once again. John doesn't have a cycle, but John gets stuck in after Christmas and after Easter and some other places. So lucky for us, we have access to a lot of that. And with that, you know as much as I do, so glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
Is there any evidence that Paul's letters influenced the gospel writers?
It's hard to say. There's certainly lots of connections thematically between what goes on in Mark and what goes on in Paul's writings. But they not that. Remember, the gospel material circulated orally. And that material. Most people say he never saw a written gospel because he died before any of them was actually written down. But the tradition that ultimately went into the gospel would have been some tradition that Paul himself would have been familiar with. Paul never quotes Jesus, and they say it because he never knew a quote, because many times quoting would have helped him if he had the material. So they don't think that he was that close to it, but certainly some of those things were in the air at the time. So you see similar concerns that come up in Mark, that come up also in some of Paul. Way over time.
Just a quick question. So I've read a theory that says that if you read the ending of Acts, it kind of just ends, like you said.
Stops.
At the moment it ends, Paul is still alive. And they're like, well, why, if they had written it after he died, why wouldn't they have written that him and Peter died? So is there a possibility, therefore, that Luke was written in Acts, or was written before Paul died? That pulls it all back quite a few years. That means that it had to have been written before about 65 AD when Paul was executed. So I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Well, I think the version, I think Paul is a great hero for Luke. Luke really loves Paul. I don't think Luke ever knew Paul personally, even though there are we passages in the Acts of the Apostles. I don't think the we is Luke and Paul. Most of the speeches in Acts, the ones that Peter gives and the ones that Paul give, are really the work of Luke. The goal of the Acts of the Apostles is to get the church to Rome. It moves from the one center, Jerusalem, to now the new center, Rome. Once Paul and Peter, they got them in Rome, then as far as Luke is concerned, that was my task. Now, you have to say, well then if that was your task, why did you build up this drama about Paul all in those last chapters, wanting to go down to Rome, wanting to have his day in court, the Jews saying, shut up and go home. We don't have any argument with you. You go down there, they'll nail you. I'm a Roman citizen. I get, you get that drama and you're, what's going to happen? You're waiting and then, you never know. But, lots of people have wondered about that in the dating of Acts. And previous to critical scholarship, the idea was it was a factual history of the early Christian community, and Paul was kind of biography in there from Luke. The modern scholarship finds that the Paul that you have in the Acts of the Apostles, granted there's historical aspects to that, but generally has been reshaped by Luke to fit Luke's theology. You can find lots of arguments on both sides of that story.
I have a question.
Last one, or we'll have to stay here for breakfast.
I hope you can hear me from here. Thank you, first of all, though. Earlier you said when Jesus was on the cross and he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? I got the impression that you were thinking that Jesus didn't know that.
Who listened to know that?
Pardon?
Who heard that?
It sounded like you were saying that Jesus didn't know why he was there, like God had really.
No, what I'm saying is the way Mark portrays Jesus is he does not allow Jesus to have any more than his human understanding at the time. And as a human, it appears to Jesus that this has been a failure. Now, Mark has already told us early on that's not the case. But the people inside the story do not know that. And so Mark will always tell us Jesus is divine and has a true divine nature, but when he's living out his human life, he doesn't live out of the divine nature.
So then is the story that I've heard that people who knew the Psalms would have known that was the first line of Psalm 22, which you said, but they also would have known how Psalm 22 ends, which is that God is being glorified and he is sending the Redeemer. Was that something that would not have been really understood until later?
That is an argument you'll find in a variety of places that says a typical psalm, lamenting psalm, has two parts. The first part is the lament, and then the second part is where the lament will change into praise. Almost all laments do that. They also say, or maintain, was a practice of if you want to say the whole psalm, you wouldn't have to say the whole psalm, you just say the first line, and everybody knows you mean the whole psalm. This is a nice way of getting you off the hook with Jesus being in a state of dereliction. Rather, he's in a state of praise because he's stating Psalm 22, which really, if you read it long enough, means he ends up by praising God. Now, there will be scholars who will argue for that position. And there are scholars who argue against that position, claiming there's really not enough evidence to show that that is the case. If you put it within the total theological context of Mark, then the only thing that makes sense is when Jesus is really lamenting. He is lamenting because that's the fourth and major rejection that he has suffered all along. But you'll find scholarship on both sides arguing vehemently. And it is true that every lament, almost every lament in the Psalms, does have that second part. It changes to praise. So you can just look that up for yourself. Whether there really was the practice of, if I want to say the entire psalm, I'll just start it out and you'll know that I mean the whole thing. Even if there is that practice and I can substantiate it, then you have to move further and say, how do I know that that's what Jesus was doing when he was saying that psalm? I tend to think that what he was doing was, in Mark's theology, even though he feels God has abandoned him, he will never abandon God. And so his final words are not like, well, you really messed me up, God. You sold me a bill of goods, or stuff like that. Say, no, his final words are words of prayer. Even though they are lamenting prayer, they're still prayer, which by that I think Mark is saying, even though Jesus might have felt, historically, as if God had abandoned him, he never abandoned God. And remember, Mark is trying to show us a model we can follow. And so that's to encourage us. Never abandon. No matter how dark it gets, don't abandon God. And of course, next thing you know is, and the curtain in the temple was torn in two, and the old is gone and the new is come. So we know, in fact, God did not abandon Jesus. At least that's the way I would take it.
Well, thank you so much for coming. It was easy for me, even when I gave you this, I felt awesome task of, in 4 hours, putting together the construction of our the 4 Gospels, that it might be too much, but no, it's not. So thank you. And I hope you'll come again one day and talk to us, maybe individually, about these wonderful gospel stories. Thank you all for coming as well. For those who came for catechology, don't forget to sign that sheet out of the kiosk.